welcome to the afternoon session of Sunday of the Bray Literary Festival. And we are in very good company this afternoon. We are discussing a very important new anthology, which has just been published, called Her Other Language, which is an anthology of writing by women in Northern Ireland in response to issues of domestic abuse and violence. It was published earlier this year by the Of Mouth Collective and Arlen House. It features work by 95, I counted, possibly wrong, women writers, and we are joined today by 5 of them, and they are, and I'll list them in alphabetical detail: Siobhán Campbell, who is a poet, critic, author of 6 books of poetry, the most recent being Heat Signature, which was published by Seren in 2017, and she was co-editor with me of Evan Boland Inside History. Ruth Carr, who edited The Female Line, a very famous anthology of Northern Irish writing by women in 1985. And since then, she has worked with community writing groups. She co-founded the Word of Mouth Women's Poetry Collective and edited various publications. She has 3 collections of poetry, the most recent being Feather and Bone, which again was published by Arlen House in 2018. Natasha Cuddington was born in Saskatchewan in 1974 and studied creative writing and English literature at Concordia. She then came to Belfast to do an MA in Irish Studies. Her translations and reviews have appeared in a number of journals, including Ciphers, Poetry Ireland, Modern Poetry in Translation. And she has, in addition, received a number of grants from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. And her debut poetry collection, Each of Us, Our Chronic Alphabets, was published by Arlen House in 2018. Jo Egan is a playwright and theatre maker who works in Belfast and London. She's currently artistic director of Maca Productions, and she created the award-winning Wedding Community Play in 1999, and co-wrote and directed Crimea Square with Shankill Residents in 2013. She was due to have a play on in the Mac in Belfast in March called Body Politics. I'm guessing that didn't happen, Jo? It'll be back. It will be back. And our final participant here is Claire Gallagher, who is a primary school teacher from Derry, who writes fiction and poetry and completed an MA in creative writing at Bath Spa, and she has featured in the new Irish writing section in the Irish Times. So we're going to hear more from each of them shortly, but if I can begin with Ruth and Natasha, who are the co-editors of this anthology. Can you tell me about, how it came to be, why this anthology, and what did it aim to do?
Yes, Nessa, it's lovely to be here, by the way. The anthology was the inspiration of Kelly O'Dowd, who was working with Women's Aid and had come across a wonderful anthology called Furies. This is it here, a poetry anthology of women warriors, and it was in support of Rape Crisis England and Wales. And Kelly and I had worked together in the past, so she contacted me about the idea because she was thinking of it for Women's Aid to raise the profile and support it. I was keen to help in a voluntary capacity, and that was how it began. I find a cooperative approach a very healthy one when it comes to selecting work and presenting a complex picture. So I asked fellow poet and colleague from Of Mouth, Natasha Cuddington, to work as co-editor. And that proved very fruitful in the task ahead of us. And from the very outset, we were clear this was clearly a literary venture. And their aims were several: to bring attention to the ongoing issue of domestic and sexual violence and abuse, a very real concern as evidenced in lockdown all over the world, really. And to do this through the many voices of women to include a wide range of genres, as wide as we could. So there's poetry, extracts from drama and story, and personal reflections. And we wanted the work drawn from distinguished writers to first-time writers, from emerging writers and survivors, from a real cross-section of backgrounds, age, ability, religion, ethnicity, orientation and language. And we had several pieces in Irish across the genres too, with translations. So this was an open call, and we approached as many people as we could who lived in or came from or had links with the north of Ireland, geographically speaking rather than politically. And finally, we wanted to support the work of Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid with victims and survivors as a practical outcome of the book. So this emphasis on inclusivity follows the same ethos as the female line that you mentioned earlier. It felt crucial to me that this anthology mirror that non-hierarchical approach, that there be a continuity. And in fact, there are 6 writers whose work appears in both anthologies. But the continuity mattered because it felt important, once again, to highlight the range of distinctive writing being created by women from the North, and to hear their voices on such a pressing issue, which is so deeply ingrained in our society still. And we, Natasha, myself, and Monica McWilliams, who wrote the foreword to the book, trusted that this issue, the extent of damage to mainly women's and children's lives, and how the long-term impact colours and discolours lives, was best conveyed through their hard-earned words, through women's writing itself. And the book's strength lies in their combined voices and creativity. And I hope that it can be a force for change. As Monica states in her foreword, it is time to change the narrative and to ask different questions. Abusers have to be confronted and challenged to lay down their weaponry. That quote at the end is from a poem in the book by Kathleen McCracken. I just want to say a huge thank you to all the people who helped this voluntary publication on its way, in particular the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, who were the main funder, and Damien Smith especially, because he gave us unstinting support through many loopholes and difficulties. He was there, and it was great to have him. But really, I think Natasha would agree with me that the true stars are the contributors who gave of their work freely. We didn't have a commissioning budget and felt bad about that, but they gave freely because they wanted to address this ongoing abuse and challenge it so articulately. And the success of the book, which is difficult given the COVID situations, that we're all in the same boat there, right. But the success can only be weighed, I think, in its being read and taken to heart. If you don't mind, I would like to read the poem that gave this book its title.
Please do.
Her Other Language, thank you. It was written by Nancy Matson, a Finnish-Canadian poet who moved to London in 1990. And I first heard Nancy read it in the Troubadour in London about 20 years ago. And it impressed me deeply then. And when we were putting the anthology together, it came back into my mind and it felt right for the title. Nancy's poem is a lipogram, that ancient form that places constraint on the author to write a poem that leaves out some letters of the alphabet. But in this particular poem, it also works literally, embodying the physical constraint on a woman who cannot put her lips together to make those plosive sounds, p, m, b, because it is too painful, because her jaw is smashed. Her other language is one of survival and of coping. As a title for the book, it signifies, I think, really the creative and remedial power of one's own language, of her own story, other than the one that's given, that's the dominant version. So I just find this, I hope I can do this justice. her other language. She has had to learn a language that allows only words she can say without the thick skin lines outside her teeth going anywhere near each other. In this language, the teeth, aching and dry, one cracked, stay a certain distance away. This is her language until the swelling goes down, days at least. It was his hands that did this. All she can say are ice words, stone words, dust words, tongue against the teeth words, dull sounds through the throat. Liquids are all she can swallow, through a thick straw that hurts when it touches. The slot in her jaw cannot shut. Its corners cannot turn towards her eyes. Thank you.
Such a powerful poem, and really, you know, gives the title is so thought-provoking anyway, but when you read that, and it's at the introduction of the anthology, it just creates that mood, sets that theme so well. Can I ask Natasha about, I mean, this wasn't just any anthology. There must have been significant editorial challenges in dealing with such sensitive material. Like, what were they?
Well, you know, before we sort of dig into that, I just want to firstly say that, you know, from the outset, as you suggest, you know, it was a huge privilege for us to be charged, you know, for myself included, to be charged with the co-editorship of this, what I view to be very pressing body of work. And also, and this will undoubtedly embarrass Ruth, but this sort of notion of having been tutored by Ruth and what I feel is her very particular style of editorship. I think it's very much an extension, as she suggested, of the female line, and what I would say is an ethos of radical inclusivity. You know, it's proposing a literary project that is also inclusive, and I think that ethos sort of pervaded every aspect of the project, and it's my thinking that it's led beyond the book through what we hope has been sort of our own cautious handling of the material through to a community of sorts, you know, of writers in the North. You know, as Ruth has suggested, you know, we had the problem or the opportunity of a range of genres, of formal approaches, and of notoriety, but I think most crucially of experience. And we wanted to give voice to the breadth of the submissions that we received during the Oakland call, and to sort of, if we could, delicately plug gaps in representation, as we could with the odds, you know, formal solicitation of a writer. I think central to our thinking around the project was this notion of enabling conversation, discussion, and again, that notion of radical advocacy by women about the female predicament in what is, I think, well, I don't think I know for the most part, the northern part of the island, as Ruth has suggested, this notion of the geographical area. And as we encountered, sometimes often further afield as people had been displaced. So this ideation around talk, discourse, conversation, I think is also reflective of the working relationship that Ruth and I share and have shared over a number of years. You know, we're two writers with very different formal concerns in our own production. And that, of course, necessarily extends out into ideas of taste, editorial inclinations, and preoccupations, I think. And yet we sort of, I think often we found ourselves willing to subvert those tastes and to submit to what I viewed to be the pressure of the work and the central thesis of the anthology, which was really to honor the experience of its writers. So I think often together, I hope you agree with this, we responded to pieces you know, as being necessary for inclusion as a matter of intuition, and where this wasn't the case, what followed were, as you suggested, these areas of kind of frank communication. Paramount to both of us was this idea of care, how an editorial stance would treat its practitioner, and that delicate kind of overlap, which we were, returning to over and over, this notion that victim and practitioner was so often the case, and then as in, with the added layer that for victims, this notion about care around the idea of trauma, to safeguard the work's presentations, to guard against any reading that was over simple or gratuitous. And then the very real and practical reality, or the real reality, this notion that all of these kind of editorial decisions were confounded by very acute concerns about safeguarding victims, the protection of identity in some cases.
Yes, I was going to say that one of the most moving things for me was the number of pieces under the name Anonymous.
Yes, and that was something that was advised, by various organizations, but it was also something that was very important for us to honor and to not press people.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's one of the things that this, in very real terms, this extends this idea that we have a responsibility in these editorial kinds of roles to care for people's, when the content is this charge, to care for their physical and their emotional safety, and so I think in many cases we have decided to err on the side of caution and not bring people into the public sphere for whom we think that might be a difficult proposition.
You were going to read a piece, I think, as well, by Frances Malloy?
Yes, I am. And it's, we have this debate about the dairy accent, the no dairy accent, and I'm just going to read it in my straight and slightly naff Canadian way. But I think, that this continues to be another great lesson of, thinking around this body of work, is that, this notion that the trauma continues to be pervasive, how faceted and far-reaching it is, and that this excerpt from Frances Malloy from the short story "Women Are the Scourge of the Earth" really is, it rings as germane to us as it did 30 years ago when it was written, and and it's one of those original pieces from an original contributor that still has weight across the years. So I'm going to read from Women Are the Scourge of the Earth, just an excerpt, Frances Malloy. I don't care what any of them try to tell you. I never lifted a finger to her in all the years I put up with her. Never mind what that hussy next door tries to make out. The stories I could tell you about her. You should see the odd assortment of characters that come and go there when he's out at his work, the poor bugger. There's no telling who or what fathered that crowd of cross-eyed brats of hers. I must say, it's always people like her who do all the talking. I can't imagine what kind of a man he is at all to put up with it. She should be run out of the town. Many a better woman was tarred and feathered for far less. Shooting is too good for the likes of her. That note that the missus left made out that I turned her mother and her sisters against her, but unbalanced and all as she was fly enough not to mention why. Well, I'll tell you why. So you'll not be laboring under any illusions about her. She was carrying on with a fancy man. A friend of mine spotted the same car parked outside my house on the same day every week and gave me a wink. I soon put a stop to it, I can tell you. I knocked his teeth right down his throat and let it be known that I would debollocks the bastard on the spot if he ever came snooking around my house again. I'll not be made a laughing stock of. Her mother was fuming mad when I told her the way her precious daughter was carrying on. She said the missus was no daughter of hers and that she'd never darken her door again the longest day she ever lived. And to give the woman her dues, she was as good as her word. All her sisters took my side in the matter too. You would think that she would toe the line after that, but by the blood of the crucified Jesus, God forgive me for taking that holy name, didn't she go more deranged than ever after that? She'd walk through the house in a stupor half the day, never even bothering to change from her night clothes. She was pining for him. You didn't need to be very clever to see that. All the time she kept pretending that it was her mother and her sisters that she wanted to see, and she kept on asking me to go back to them and explain that she didn't have a fancy man, that he was only her friend. I told her that it was herself who had got into the mess, and it was up to her to get herself out of it. I'm not going to be made a fool of. I'm here to defend my good name, never mind your inquest. The woman was deranged. That's the long, the tall, and the short of it. I lived with her for 15 years, and I'm telling you now, she was never in her proper mind. I don't know what I was ever thinking about having anything to do with the likes of her in the first place when I think of some of the women I could have had me pick of. I could have done a lot better for myself and married a good, strapping farmer's daughter with a bit of capital behind her. Indeed, I'll have you know, I could have had any woman I wanted, just for the asking. And here's another thing I wanted to draw your attention to, just when you're at it. A woman is supposed to obey her husband, is she not? She's supposed to do what he bids her, is she not? Isn't that what the law says? Isn't it? And isn't it wrote in the Bible by that hand of the Almighty himself? Well, that woman never did my bidding in her life. Never once in 15 years could I get her to do my bidding. For example, I told her to keep away from your woman next door. I didn't want no wife of mine consorting with the likes of her. But did she heed me? Like hell she did. My friend seen that trollop from next door in having tea with her ladyship whenever I was out at my work. My blood still boils when I think of it. The likes of that trash gossiping in my house and me out breaking my back to earn the money to entertain her. I soon put a stop to that, mine. I locked the outside doors to the house and took the keys with me back to work for a week or so and made it be known to the madam next door that if she wanted to visit my house, she could try getting in and out of the windows. I'll have you know, I won't be made a fool of.
Wow, very, very powerful writing. If I can move on to Claire, because I know you're going to read your piece in the anthology and also a poem by Moya Cannon. Do you want to do that first and then maybe tell us a little about your feelings about the anthology?
Sure, that sounds good. So I'll start with my own poem, Withholding. I won't tell you I see daily change in your face, that breakfast is no longer my favorite meal. I won't tell you I note every dip in the clink of your voice, that this house is never without background radio. I won't tell you I sense the new height you're intent on, that I've been going through old photographs. I won't tell you there will soon be no place for my lips on your skin, that I will allow this. I won't tell you these changes you move quietly about in, to me, are bin lids banging a warning. I won't tell you, son, that the days are inching you into a man I once knew, whose love was spit and fists.
Claire, that's fantastic, and the subtext, you know, what you're not suggesting about what you're drawing the reader in. Do you want to talk just a little about how you came to that?
Sure. I didn't want to come at it full on because it felt very intense for me, and I know Natasha's mentioned the sensitivity of the subject. So for me as a writer, it was trying to find a way in that I could relate to, but that I wasn't trying to dictate someone else's lived experience. So how it came about was actually, I have my nephew to thank for that. He came for a sleepover, and while he was staying with me, I was just thinking to myself that the time would come that he would no longer who wanted to come to his auntie's for sleepovers. He was getting to that age where he would outgrow it. And with children, while it's always a pleasure watching them grow and a real honour, there's also that sadness attached of the child.
Sure.
And so from that, the poem kind of developed from there, that was a way in, which was meaningful for me and which made it less direct as looking at the issue.
Yeah.
So
the truth and the slatness, as Emily Dickinson would say.
Exactly.
So you've chosen a Moya Cannon poem to read as well, haven't you?
I have, yes. So I hope I can do this one justice. So I've chosen Timbre by Moya Cannon. It just struck me as a really beautiful, poignant poem. And it's a poem about words and their power. So I felt that it was really apt for today, and how words are a chosen thing, that they can hurt or they can heal, and that sense of responsibility of it with our words, and also as writers when we're taking on a project like this, that sense of responsibility. So I thought it was really apt, and I think it also suggests that events and life experiences are stored within us, and they don't ever fully go away. So I think it's a really good message for the anthology. So this is Timbre by Moya Cannon. A word does not head out alone. It is carried about the way something essential, a blade, say, or a bowl, is brought from here to there when there is work to be done. Sometimes, after a long journey, it is pressed into a different service. A tree keeps its record of the temper of years well hidden. After the timber has been sawn, rough rings release the song of the place, droughts, good summers, long frosts, the way pain and joy unlock in a voice.
Beautifully read, thank you. And having been part of this anthology, has it, because you would have read all the submissions, has it made you think differently about what you write and how you write? And
yeah, it's such a diverse collection, and I love the idea of the inclusivity of it. And you know, there's such a range there, and it's wonderful to be in the company of great writers, but also women who are survivors. That's what made it more important again for me, to be in the company of those. So yes, and the fact that there's a mix of genre as well, it helps you to look outside of yourself and look outside of your style of writing and look at how such large topics and challenges like this can be dealt with in so many different ways. For me, a real highlight of this was that I was fortunate enough to be able to attend one of the events, one of the readings in Belfast. And as anyone who was there will know, it was just so powerful to be in that room and to bear witness to some women who had a direct experience of this, to get up and not only find their voice in the writing of it, but to then stand up in a room full of strangers and use their voice again to regain their power and assert their strength. And it was a really, really powerful thing to be part of. And all credit to Ruth and Natasha for organising it and all the hard work behind the scenes.
Sonny, it's making me just wonder, because I've often used this phrase myself in writing workshops. If you can put it down on paper, it takes the pain out of it. I wonder, does it totally? I wonder.
I don't think it will remove all the pain, but I think there's definitely a therapeutic effect of writing. It's proven from the beginning of time that it has a healing quality. So I think it will. I really hope that it will have had an impact on all those women who were brave enough to do that. I think you are taking a little bit out of your head and putting it down on paper, and while it won't fully remove that, I think it goes a small way to regaining a little bit of power and making it your experience and speaking of it and not hiding from it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
Well, you did mention the multi-genres, and that's a lovely sort of segue into asking Jo about, because you included an extract from your play Sweeties, didn't you?
I did.
And you're going to very kindly read from that. And then just maybe talk to us a bit about, you know, writing that kind of traumatic material in dramatic form.
Okay. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of it now. Sweeties is about Tracy and Paula regularly goes in to visit a pedophile. She's a 9-year-old girl, and we're now in the present when Tracy and Paula would be about 40. Tracy doesn't have anything to do with her anymore, and she's deeply affected by the fact that she waited for Paula to come outside, and she used to share in the sweets that Paula had been given. Paula has gone on with her life, but somehow or other Tracy hasn't been able to continue with hers. But Tracy's talking to her sister Jen, and she talks about the one time she went into Pa Devitt's and the experience that she had. Now, nothing happens. I need to state that beforehand. But what it is it, for me, I wrote it because so many people talked about the nature of children being complicit in their own downfall with their abuse. And I kind of wanted to create something that argued against that. Tracy. I knock into Paula's man. She says, gonna kill her, still waiting on the milk for the tea. I skate over to Pa Devitt's shop. He's closing up for the half day Wednesday. He says, is she inside with Mrs. Devitt? Sure, go on into her. As I clomp over to the door leading to the TV room from the shop, I hears Pa Devitt slide the bolt. A hole comes into my tummy, because at the same time I see the sitting room's empty. Ach, is she not there, says he, coming up behind me. Where's that cheeky cat? Sure, they'll be back in a minute. Sit you down. I stay standing. Mr. Devitt, my mammy'll be wanting me. He holds out both his hands, clenched into fists. Pick a hand. I point to his left. He hands me a bounty. He sits down in an old armchair. Switch on the TV there for us. I tramp over, turn it on, and stomp back to the fireplace. He's as neat as a pin. He's wearing those stay-pressed trousers, and the smell of aftershave's knocking me down. He starts, your mammy was talking to Mrs. Devitt in the shop. Says you hasn't been well, you poor wee dote. I'm all right now, Mr. Devitt. And God, but your mummy's a lovely woman. And has you lovely. And they're lovely ski pants, Siobhan, says he. Where'd you get them? I don't know, Mr. Devitt. Well, I'd love to get a pair of them for my wee granddaughter. Where now do you think they were got? I don't know, says me. Says he, would the name be on the back of the label? I twist around trying to peer down the back of my ski pants to see the label. I can't see, says. Well, it must be down the seam. Sure, take them off, says he. Don't be worrying. I've children myself. I can't, Mr. Devitt, says me, shaking my head, putting my chin to my chest. Why not, says he. Sure, as safe as a row of houses. I said, my mummy would knock me into next week if I did. I won't tell her, says he. It doesn't matter, I said. She'll know. How will she know if you don't tell her, says he. You don't know my mother, says I. It says a lot about our ma that I'd go against a full-grown man because I'm more afraid to go home and tell her I stood half naked in front of him. I know Pa Devitt's up to no good, but I think if he knows I know, he'll have to kill me, so I play stupid. He sits watching me, smoking, and says nothing. Then he goes, what would you do if a stranger offers you a lift? I'm always telling wee Janie Norton not to get into strangers' cars. Do you know why? Yes, says me. My mummy says he'll kidnap and murder me. No, says he, that's not what they'll do. They'll try and rape you, won't they? I say nothing. Do you know what that is? Says he. I say nothing. Well, if one of those men gets a hold of you, and fuck me if he doesn't go into the gory details. I'm standing at his mantelpiece, squeezing the bounty bar to sludge, thinking, how the fuck do I get out of here? So he finishes, your man dad does that. No, she doesn't, says I. She does, says he. You don't know my ma, says me. Not a hope. I shakes my head. He sits watching me through his cigarette smoke. Nice one, Tracy, I think. You want out and you get into a conversation about men's willies. Through the wee gap down the side of the Venetian blinds, I catches a flash of kids running past. There's Paula, says I, and I trundle in my skates over to the window, because I think if everyone sees me, he can't murder me. He lets rip a gondola. Don't touch the blinds! And here, what do? I get such a fright. I lose my balance at the corner of the fucking rug, trip forward and grabs onto the blind. There's this edge where the blind must have been weak, and that's the bit that breaks off in my hand. Well, for fuck's sake, Jesus, he's livid. What am I going to say to Mrs. Devitt? I'm sorry, Mr. Devitt. I'm really sorry. You stupid wee bitch, says he. And he holds me out by the neck and hooshes me out the shop door like he spat me out. I give Paula half a warm squash bounty and tell her what happened. She near wets herself. Ha, I can't believe you break his blinds. And I'm chuffed to bits with myself for outsmarting him.
Wow. And that play premiered in the Grand Opera House in Belfast in 2014, didn't it?
Yeah, there was a shorter piece in 2014, but it was actually the extended version was part of Body Politics that was going on in March.
But what was the reaction in 2014? Is because I'm wondering around whether there's more receptivity to tough subject matter in dramatic forms than, say, in poetry, for example. Do people almost, you know, they know that the Greeks did pretty awful things back a few thousand years ago. So are they ready for this kind of material in drama in a way that they mightn't be in other forms?
Well, one of the things that came up during the work with this was that there was quite a lot of comedy, which sounds ridiculous when you talk about pedophilia, but when I interviewed a woman for 6 years about this subject matter, and actually during the exchange and the interviews, a lot of it was dealt with by comedy. When the play was coming out in 2014, and I was working at a lot of writers groups across the city, some of the women would say, "What are you working on now?" And I would tell them it would lead to a similar discussion. And again, there was some very, you know, there was revelations given, but there was also dealt with this kind of almost sort of looking at oneself and laughing at one's naivety or the ridiculous situations you got yourself into, somehow also provided an element of comedy. You know, so this is also part of the piece. So I wouldn't say it was a comedy, but I would say that the way in which we try and lift each other up, comedy is part of tragedy. It walks very closely beside it.
Coping mechanism.
Coping mechanisms, yeah.
And what was the reaction to audiences in 2014?
Well, because there was, in the beginning of the piece, there's obviously more comedy and it moves into a much darker place. I did think more of them would walk out than did. And one of those being is that the language, I kept in some of the language because that language was the language that was used on the streets. So all this language that's being used is about the violent act of sex, of rape, and that is they're the expletives that people are washed in the streets and that people use. So it was important to have it in the play. But so some people found the language itself more offensive than the actual story we were trying to tell. I think some people felt really uncomfortable with it, but other people were very, very moved by it. There are revelations that I hadn't seen, that the woman I was interviewing brought me to understand. And actually, as a playwright, they're pure gold. They're the things that become the pivotal turning points in the drama.
And it's so much part of your process that you're working with people, listening to people, going into communities. So there can never be a question of appropriation or whatever, because it's the horse's mouth. You've heard right. Those experiences, and you're giving them dramatic form in ways.
Yeah. Yes, it was also very important because the paramilitary and murder is quite often the story you hear from Belfast. Whereas there were a lot of women desperately trying to hold families together, and those stories, or the story of the damage that was done, quite often weren't the most important. And when it was only when, you know, after the post Good Friday Agreement that there was a lot more sort of examination and aspects of sexual abuse, domestic abuse, these issues were able to come out and have their own, you know, their own position.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think you were going to read another piece by Myra Vennard.
I do. So Myra Vennard retired to Ballycastle and became a mature student in the 1990s, graduating from the University of Ulster with a BA Honours in English and an MA in Anglo-Irish Literature. And quite a lot of her study was on the work of Samuel Beckett, and a lot of her poetry seems to inhabit that same space. So this is a piece by Myra called Falling. Look up. Treetops are meeting in the morning sky. There is a terrible, sad beat in the sea. Love has no mind, only this. Light will own the waters, it will rise before the overhang darkens the surface. Light will bend down under the bridge, taking the river rush running crystal down, down over rock and stone to own the sea and meet the incoming flux.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nessa.
Well, if I can move on to the complete stranger in the room, to me, Siobhán Campbell. No, she is one of my very good friends, and I'm delighted to see her. Siobhán, you've got a poem included in here, and I know you're going to read a couple of others. Would you perhaps read your own first, and we'll have a little chat?
Okay, will do. So this is a poem that I think is about who has the power to do the telling. And it relays a story as told by a Shando storyteller called the Shanachie in this poem. And the Shanachie seems to be unironically mixing folklore with what may be a very dark tale indeed, possibly even an apologia for violence. But the speaker, I think, is coming to some realization of this by the end of the poem. And I hope that's, in a sense, a move towards a different kind of telling. The story goes, the man shouldn't have left that night of the yellow storm, left his wife and the child in her hand-rocked cradle. Would he not have known the curse of the changeling could come any time before the first birthday? Why would his woman have turned from him, except in fear she'd have another child for the fairies? How she spurned him in the field in front of the others, bringing the tea cold and bread hard as the hobs of hell. He was a man who put £5 into the pot at Christmas for the hurling field to be flattened out of a hill that no one could farm. He was a grand man to talk to, brought woodbines back from any fair he was at, and would share them for a sip of the fiery brew. Was it any wonder when he left that night of the yellow storm to check on sheep and lambs on the far side of the island that the chief fairy came and battered his wife to a pulp, took the child completely away, never even left a replacement? The Shanachie ends on a long moaning drone, dread to hear. There's a woman dead and a child lost, and a poor man to comfort with his tipsy.
You're wonderful. I was going to say that you are just a wonderful poet for spotting those hypocrisies and nailing them. You know, those little things of society that we, sure, you know, it's just the way. And yet, if you confront them, if you describe them for what they actually are, you know, the man who give 5 shillings for a completely futile exercise, but will still be capable of the brutality that's been alluded to there. Do you feel angry when you write sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. I do, and you can feel there's a lot of anger in this book. But the wonderful thing is that there's a transformational moment in many of the poems where the anger has become, as Ruth said, a literary moment. And that's what raises it into art, you know. And that's what re-struck me as I reread the work, coming to have a talk with all of you. Just how powerful that is. And in a way, that's what art can do, you know. It can marshal that anger, it can bring that anger somewhere else, it can make something transform and change. And at its best, it can make us imagine different futures that plays back into actual lived realities, you know.
Because I'm wondering whether some people might automatically hear of the subject matter and go, oh, not for me, no. you'd clearly not agree.
Oh, well, no, I thought that myself. When Natasha and Ruth first raised this, I was shuddering in my shoes, and I was thinking, whoa, these are brave women to take on this set of topics. And how are they going to do this? I mean, I literally, didn't know how they'd approach editing such a work and putting it together. And that's what I have learned from, seeing this come together in their very capable hands, is that they have an approach to, I'm sorry to talk about you in the third person, Natasha and Ruth. Natasha and Ruth have a great approach to this work, which is, it's really underpinned by a deep understanding that actually we're all able for difficult subject matter. And we don't have to package poems, with a bow and, tie it for you at the end or whatever. In fact, readers are actually able and respond even more, maybe, to work that talks to them about their actual lived life that they're doing and that they're trying to keep doing, and the individual voices in this book really shine through. It doesn't matter whether they're a so-called writer. We're all writers in this book, and it's just a privilege to be in it. So I too had some of those reservations, but they're gone, and I mean the book speaks for itself.
You had chosen another poem to read by Judith Thurley.
Yes, indeed. I have two, if you can fit me in.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, in fact, I chose, as it happened.
Yes, Florence Hayhoe as well.
That's right, yeah. I chose two County Down writers without knowing I was doing that. Florence Hayhoe, who's also a multimedia artist, look out for her work, clearly multi-talented. And she responds to the natural world quite often in her work, as well as obviously other kinds of experience. And then Judith Thurley, who also pursues non-fictional writing rooted in nature. So in fact, they're probably quite linked in interesting ways. But the two poems, as you'll hear in this, are quite different from each other. So I'll read Florence Hayhoe's first, and hers is called Consequences, which immediately is a title that draws you right in. And she makes us hear those consequences and feel them. And there's no spare words in this poem. It's pared right down. Florence makes us feel that an act of violence, we understand it's not actually over. It has repercussions. The repercussions continue. And the awful thing is they may actually be passed along through time, unless we can find a way to stop. Consequences. Chattering teeth, chills ascending, bones trembling, shallow breath. An avalanche of stampeding horses, pinheading in my gut. Hooves hailing down, bruising my belly. A cauldron of erupting emotion, slicing me, keening and keeling through the decades, to deposit into the sewers a roared footprint of a forgotten time that was not as it should have been. So it's powerful stuff, and that pared down approach really seemed to me to fit the subject matter.
Absolutely.
And so then I'll read from Judith Thurley's longer work. The longer work is called Threshold. And as we were just sort of saying, in a way, there are moments in this book where the active power is the act of making a piece of art, is the act of making something that speaks, is the act of giving voice. And this poem, to me, is where creating the kind of image that is perfectly formed, because it's filled with emotion, is what makes the reader stop and take a breath. And you're forced to reread, go back to the beginning and look at how did you do that? You know, the swerve of it, the verve of it, how satisfying that is, you know, and that's what makes you remember it and turn back to it. And this is what Judith Thurley does here. From Threshold. When he knew the change in me, his yes turned to no. He was all mad fists, teeth, and demon brow. I fell on the floor, I fell on the road. I walked by myself through the world. And you, my beloved zygote, tiny refugee, little boat person, adrift in the Amnion Sea, hearing everything. I took you in and single-handedly made for you a home, 2 up, 2 down, in the velvet chambers of my heart.
Stunning, absolutely stunning. Thank you, Siobhán. If I can go back to Natasha and Ruth, it's predominantly Northern Irish writers. I did recognise a few names that I'd regard as from our parish, Nell Regan being one of them, and you know Celia Dufresne is originally from up north, has been living down here a number of times, but they're certainly both friends of the Bray Literary Festival. Do you think there's space for an island-wide anthology?
Yes, I think there is. I think there's space for many anthologies because no anthology can encapsulate everything. It's always a selection. And the beauty of it is with different editors, you get different sorts of collections, anthologies. I think they're a very healthy thing. If we had had more money, if we could have afforded it, we could have put more people, more poems, more pieces of writing in there. So you have to cut your cloth as well. But I think that experience is not just Northern or Southern or Eastern or Western. So I'm all for more anthologies, yes.
And I think this is a human experience. It's not just a regional one. You were going to just read one or two other selections yourself. We're coming kind of towards the
time.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I will just read 2 very brief pieces. They're both taken from the anthology's second section, Multiple Wounds. The first is by Jo Burns, who's a poet originally from County Derry and who's now resident in Germany. And again, this ties in with this idea that you just explored about this notion of people who have been included here, who have rationalized themselves as Northern, from, having attachments, familial and others, to place. This is a poem taken from Doramar Cubic, which is a sequence of poems that were written to voice the female figures, including wives, lovers, and daughters that were attached to Picasso. Jo Burns, Weeping Woman, from Doramar Cubic. It's my turn. Cigar ember stubbed out by his shoe. He immortalizes that which he's formed me into. A souvenir stub of travels he took into my gut, my entirety, a teardrop of paint on his brush. And this final piece that I'll read is also, again, taken from that section, Multiple Wounds. And it was written by an emerging Belfast poet by the name of Susanna Galbraith. And Susanna is currently the editorial officer at Abridged magazine. Susanna Galbraith, female, after Modigliani. That pubic curl spasms writing into the meaning of blue, what it hides and where it clots. That shoulder shoulders into it and something resists, as in living. Human at the ends of her hair and falling. She comes toward, brutal-cheeked, out of the red, the dark, the unsure, still festering a little blind pain behind her. There is a light, but where is there a light? It is pressing, she is not looking. I could do nothing if she looked. Don't look, I could do nothing.
Mm. And Ruth, did you have one that you wanted to read?
Yes, I would love to close with a reading from the final section, which has the heading Bird's Nest in the Smallest of Our Words. And it's from the same section that Mara Venner's poem is in. As Monica McWilliams said, you know, there's joy and pain in the reading of this book, and there's more joy towards the end, because as Siobhan said, there's a lot of transformational movement in the work. And this section makes a claim for safe space, community, courage, and autonomy. And I'm going to read a piece that is from an anonymous contributor. It's called Gardening with Pearls. But do not underestimate the journey it took to achieve this easy tone in this piece. It's come a long way. Gardening with Pearls. I sit in the lean-to gaze at my garden. Right now, it's a sea of waving leaves and stems springing from mismatched and colourful containers. Driftwood branches are hung with wire birds and wind chimes. Nothing is regulated, ordered, controlled. Everything can grow to its full potential. And I realise this garden is me now. I have created this almost wildness from a concreted square. This garden reflects the journey from a world where everything was controlled. You never liked to share that garden, that house, with me. You always referred to it as yours. You nearly succeeded in making me disappear, controlling me the way you attempted to control the dawn, Canute-like every week. I just about kept hold of my sanity with the mantra, I am not a bad person. You had your particular brand of weed killer and I was sprinkled with it. You pruned my confidence at every attempt to reach the light. There are no rules, no restrictions, no approval needed, no opinions that need to be sought. There is only gardening with pearls.
Super, super. And as you say, that having gone through and out the other side sense comes across really, really strongly there. Thank you so much. And just as sort of a shout out to both of Mouth and the incredibly important work you're doing, but also Alan Hayes of Arlen House, who I think is an incomparable supporter of women's writing on this island, and Arlen House is the co-publisher of this publication. So bravo both for bringing this together. And you know, we've been talking a little about the problems that COVID has created, not the least being the difficulties for books that have just come out during its period of occupation, if I can call it that. So important to say that you can get her other language. All proceeds go direct to, or certainly proceeds go direct to Women's Aid. And you can get it from the wonderful No Alibis bookshop in Botanic Avenue in Belfast. You can get it online, and we will put a link up on the live chat here so that people can follow that link. and it's also available in Waterstones. And if you're still not able to get a copy, do contact Ruth or Natasha, and we'll put their email address up as well. And I want to thank the sponsors for this event, in particular the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, who generously supported this individual event, as well as the festival's other main sponsors, the Arts Council of Ireland on Corleoline, the Open University, Bray Chamber, Mermaid Arts Centre, the Stinging Fly, Dublin One City One Book, and the A+ Service Centre. Next up, because you're going to stay in your seats, I know you are, is the Lit Fix, which will be hosted by Tanya Farrelly, featuring Henrietta McCurvey, Alan McMonigal, and Neil Hegarty. But in the meantime, I just want to say thanks so much to Ruth Carr and Natasha Cuddington, Siobhán Campbell, Joe Egan, and Claire Gallagher. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nessa.